welcome to my cozy art channel. If you're new here, my name is Melanie and I am a watercolor or mixed media artist, but I also like to work digitally in Procreate on my iPad when I'm making coloring books or picture books. Today, I thought it would be super fun to sketchbook together, so please go grab your sketchbook and your favorite supplies and make some art with me. I'm providing this reference image and it will stay on the screen as I work today throughout the video. This is an image I took while on our very first trip as a family of 3 to Washington State in 2022, and our daughter was actually only 3 years old at the time. So you have my full permission to make some artwork with this image as it is my own photograph. So let's make some art. I will be starting with my watercolor pencils and some Color II Pastels for this sketchbook painting. However, you're going to see that things go wrong pretty quickly here because the paper that I'm using is not suitable for what I tried to do. But that's totally okay. That's what sketchbooking is all about. I learned a lot of valuable lessons here. So the paper that I'm using, this is a soft cover mixed media art journal by Strathmore. Now, I prefer their watercolor version. They have a mixed media or a watercolor version of this soft cover journal. And I absolutely love the soft cover and I love the watercolor version. It can handle the amount of water that I tend to throw at paper because I started out as a watercolor artist. I've just recently, over the last 2 years, really started adding in more types of media. So here's where things start to take a bad turn. I put down a lot of water here. I'm using a very fat brush by Princeton. This is their oval wash brush and it can hold a lot of water. So I usually use it to lay down my clean water before dropping in color. So here I was trying to make like this soft blue gradient to go in the background to be my sky. And so now the paper is wet, very wet. And I tried to come back in with my watercolor pencils to put in some more color. And it tore this paper up. Like these little dark spots you're seeing are actually like the paper pilling up. And so I just was like, oh my gosh, well, I've kind of committed now. And it just gets worse. I don't know why I continued on, but I thought in my head I would be able to smooth it back out with more water, which just, that did not work. Okay, so lesson learned here. Save this technique for true watercolor paper. So I'm just making things worse here. You can actually see the little bits of paper just moving all over, and it does soften up a little bit. So things get better, and I do fix this. It's not unfixable. I add in some Neocolor and I add in some actual watercolor on top of this, and so this is actual watercolor now that I'm adding over the top just to kind of fill in those spots that I made where I scraped away paper. And because I'm going to be putting trees and stuff over the top, it's totally fine. And this is a sketchbook. This isn't a piece of artwork that I plan to sell or scan in and make something with. I am showing up in my sketchbook to learn today. And you know what? I had a very valuable lesson right off the start. So anyway, I hope you guys don't mind. I'm going to keep this sketchbook session very casual, chatty. I'm not even going to script this. I'm just going to kind of talk to you guys as I work, and I hope that's okay with you. I hope you have fun with this, and I really hope you're making some art with me. So really quick, I'll just kind of give you a rundown of some of my supplies here. I started with my watercolor pencils, which are from Staedtler. I believe it's a German company, and they're okay. Like I've never used any other kind of watercolor pencil yet, so like I'm happy with what I have. And then these Neocolors that you see up on top of the screen were actually gifted to me because a crafty family member passed away 2 years ago and I was lucky enough to inherit a lot of her supplies. So that's where they're actually vintage. So if you're looking at them and you're thinking that's not what Neocolors look like anymore, you would be correct. These are very old and cracking, but they still work. They do a beautiful job and they're fun. Like you can't be super precise with these. They do make you loosen up quite a bit, which is something that I needed in my sketchbook practice. I don't want to be a realistic painter Like I want to move away from that. It's what I used to think I had to do as a young adult, or even as a high schooler. I thought that the only art that mattered was realistic art, and I'm so glad I've learned or unlearned that toxic thought that that's how you had to make art to be legit. Because now I just love playing with color and texture and adding whimsy to all of my work. So anyway, that was a little tangent. As far as my watercolors, I use a huge mixture of brands. I'm not super loyal to just one brand, really, of anything that comes to paper, brushes, everything. I am willing to try pretty much any material you give me. But I do really love Daniel Smith watercolor, and I like the watercolor from Prima Marketing, which I think they might have a different, they've either changed their name or they run two different companies. But they sell like their little tins of watercolors. So they have different sets that you can get, and I've purchased several of them. I really love their pastel set, which you can actually see in frame here right on the right side of the screen towards the like bottom third. Those pastels are super fun to layer over like a dark watercolor. So that's kind of my supplies rundown. I have a few colored pencils that are other brands that I will use at the end after everything is dried. I will use like my Prismacolors and even some really old vintage Faber-Castell pencils that I absolutely love, which were again gifted to me from another family member when they were getting rid of all of their old art supplies. I've inherited a lot of old supplies, and it's really fun because it's things that I never would have purchased for myself, because I don't want to spend that money on those things right now without what I feel to be a valid reason when I already have so many things. So the fact that I get to try out these things that I, again, would not have purchased has been really cool. It has really gotten me out of my watercolor comfort zone and developed my style in this mixed media world that I've dived into. So going back to my thoughts on not really wanting to make realistic art anymore, my approach to this reference image is to just take in the color, take in the texture, and feel free to take creative liberty with the actual composition and what's in the actual photo. So these trees are not exactly how they look in the photo. However, I am looking to the colors and the textures, and I am a big fan of moss. So part of what I wanted to try to figure out in this sketchbook painting is how can I get that amazing mossy texture and color. And I don't think I was 100% successful here, but I did learn some things. The techniques that you're going to see me try on these trees is really interesting. It's not something I've ever done before, and I learned some things I liked and some things I didn't. So essentially, the approach I was taking here was to build up this color and get that dark, barky looking color first. Then I wanted to wet them down once I got to that portion, and then try to build the light color back over the top, which was kind of difficult with these Neo colors. With each different supply, you have to take a different approach, right? So for instance, when I'm working with acrylic paint, I know that I like to work from the back of the image to the front, and to remember that things are going to dry darker. When I work with watercolor, I work from light to dark, and I remember that things are going to dry lighter. And so because these Neo colors and even the watercolor pencils are somewhat new to me in how I'm working in this sketchbook, I have to learn how they're going to dry and what order of operations I should take when working with these things. So it's just fun. It's fun to play. It's fun to be a student of this material again and have to kind of start over with learning new techniques and playing and experimenting. So I'd love to know in the comments, are you a fan of neocolors or any kind of like water soluble pastel, have you ever used something like this before, or even watercolor pencils? I think for me, I prefer the watercolor pencils with just a touch of neocolor. This sketchbook session ended up being very heavy on the neocolor with very little pencil involved. And so that's probably why I'm a little bit uncomfortable with how this turned out, because it's so new to me. But again, I'm gonna keep coming back to this. I learned a lot. I learned so much, and I was truly playing. I was doing exactly what you should be doing in a sketchbook. And I don't want to sound whiny like this. It's not that this painting turned out horrible. I'm sure there are many of you that are going to look at this and say like, oh my God, I love that. You're crazy. What are you talking about? It just was not what I was hoping to have achieved with this painting. It didn't turn out the way I was envisioning in my head, because I have a lot to learn with this material. So here what you just saw happen. I thought I wanted to come in on the trees first and wet them down and start working on them, and then I realized maybe I should start tackling some of the background first, let that dry, and work on the trees last, because I need to layer that tree texture over the top of this background. But if I get that perfect texture in first on the tree and then try to come back in and do these pine trees in the background, I'm gonna mess up what I've done. So I realized that quickly and stopped what I was doing and transitioned to working in the background. And again, if you look at the reference photo, this is not what it looked like. These bluish pine trees are not exactly what's back there, but this is how I wanted to make it. So I encourage you to also add things in or change things up as you see fit. Later on in this process, you're also going to see that I add in kind of like I don't know if we call it a lake or a river, that I put in just beyond the trees in the foreground, because that also helped add some division between those pine trees in the back and the trees in the front, kind of almost like a middle ground. And it helped also the color. You'll see I put in like a very light color for that, and it really made things pop. And I think that was something I did successfully. So one thing that I found really interesting about neocolor pastels, and these are the water soluble ones again, so they act kind of like a watercolor, is you can kind of color down on the paper with them, and then you can get them wet to really intensify their color, but then you can also like pick up the color and move it around to other spots in the painting, almost like you're using your painting as a palette. Does that make sense? So I was kind of like taking some of that color on the pine trees and moving it down to the foreground a little bit too, just to kind of tie those colors in. So I thought that was really fun and an interesting way to work. Now I'm adding in some of my watercolor paint onto the top of this. I'm just using one of my kind of turquoisey green colors to add some dark pops into these background trees to help them have a little bit more definition. Now, this is something that you can play with. Should I have added a dark color and given them more definition, or should they really be more of a background element you don't pay a lot of attention to? That's a question that you can ask yourself as you're working on something like this. How much attention do you want to bring to your background elements? The more detail you put in, the more you're going to pay attention to them, and the more it might take away from something in the foreground. So just a little arty thought for you there. Again, I'm layering in some more of my watercolor paint, and I'm just kind of looking at my reference image, looking at some of those kind of yellowy, almost autumnal colors and tapping those in. And I've decided finally that it is a good time to start working on the trees. So I actually think I like how the background turned out. It's actually these trees that I wasn't 100% happy with. And I think I'm finally coming to the word that what it is about these that I didn't love. And I think it's that the color got muddy. It didn't turn out as vibrant as I was hoping. So this is a technique I saw somebody else doing and they were actually doing it with a watercolor pencil, but I figured if you can do this with a watercolor pencil, you can also do it with these Neocolors. And I will move this down, my hand moves down in just a minute, and you'll be able to see this a little better what I'm doing, but I'm wetting the end of the Neocolor and then painting with that color that I got onto the brush. So you see I'm putting clean water onto it and then painting with the pigment that's on the brush off of the Neocolor. And this was interesting. It was an interesting way to work. I don't know that I will do this too much unless, like in the future, unless there's like a very specific Neocolor that I love and I want to be able to paint with it a little more smoothly like this. I think I'll just end up going back to my pan paints and using them instead of trying to paint with the Neocolor like this. But say you didn't have pan sets of watercolors, but you wanted to be able to paint more smoothly and get a more sharp line, this is a way you could do it. Get your nicest watercolor brush, get some clean water, and paint onto the end of your Neocolor, and then just paint directly onto the page with that. You could get a nice crisp line that way with the color you have. So just another fun little tip for you. I also should have mentioned before, if you're thinking, my word, this woman moves quickly, I am taking small breaks here and there that are off camera. For instance, I am using my blow dryer to dry different layers before I move on. So in the beginning, I dried it right after doing the disastrous background, and then I dried it again after working on the pine trees. So I am taking a few minutes here and there to dry things before moving on, so that way I'm not making a mess. And then there were a couple of little times where I had to walk away and take care of something else. So don't feel like you have to work as quickly as I do. You can pause this, you can come back to it, you can screenshot the reference photo in the beginning and use it. I'll also include a download to the image if you'd like. So you really do have my full permission to make some artwork with this photo if you like it and it inspires you, like it inspired me. So I just don't want you to feel pressured to create as fast as humanly possible. That's not what this is about. You shouldn't feel pressure or stress. And if you do make some artwork with this image, I would love to see what you did. Like, it would totally make my day. Feel free to find me over on Instagram at the swimming owl and tag me if you share it, or let me know in the comments below. I would love to know if you create something with this photo. That would be really cool. So here you're gonna see me try to start figuring out this mossy texture. I am trying this painting with the Neocolor stick to create the first layer of texture, and I start to just kind of bounce back and forth between putting in some lights and then putting in some darks and then putting the lights back in. And you can see that I'm hesitant about this. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out this Neocolor, and it is probably why I felt like this wasn't super successful. Now I'm like trying to tap it on while it's very damp on the end, and that made an interesting texture but not quite the right texture. So I went back to painting some in and almost kind of starting over on some sections. If I had been working the way that I normally work, then I would have painted these trees in with my watercolor pans, my colors over on the right that you see. I would have put down a couple of different colors, let the colors bleed all over the place to make some interesting texture, and then when it dried, I would have come back in with a watercolor pencil or a colored pencil and created kind of a scribbly texture over the top. That's what I likely would have done if I were working in my go-to way. So this is just play. This is sketchbook play right here at its finest. So after talking this out, this actually gives me a really interesting idea, and even like another challenge idea of what if I come back to this photo again and instead this time take my normal approach of putting down the watercolor from my pan sets, letting it dry and doing the pencil over the top, and see how differently this entire piece would turn out. I think that would be super fun, and now I really want to do that. So thank you for witnessing and being a part of this revelation of mine and new self-imposed challenge. So I'm going to do that, and maybe, who knows, maybe I'll film that and you'll see that one of these days, and we can kind of compare them side by side. This playful technique of not knowing what the heck I'm doing, and the technique that is my comfort zone, or somewhat of my comfort zone. That also brings me to another thought. If you are fairly new to your sketchbook practice, something that can be really helpful is to take notes. So either during or after the process, actually write in your sketchbook, or maybe on a sticky note and tuck it in, and write a note to yourself about what you found successful in this piece, or what you'd like to try again next time, or the things you learned that you'd like to bring into another piece. So don't be afraid to make notes to yourself and keep it in your sketchbook. Like even your color palette, make note at the bottom or on the sides which colors you were grabbing. And you can do that by just making a dot of that color. Because essentially what your sketchbook is a journal. It's a journal of your artwork. And so you absolutely can write in it about how this artwork made you feel. What are the parts about it that excited you? What are the things you'd like to try differently next time? Don't be afraid to write in your sketchbook and let it look messy. It does not need to look picture perfect. You don't have to put it on Instagram. You don't have to share this with anybody, okay? It can be just for you. I share my sketchbook because, well, one, yes, I am running an art business, and two, I hope to inspire you to create and get messy in your sketchbook. I am here to be your cheerleader too, and to show you that we all mess up. We all make things that we're not happy with. We all make things that we call mistakes. And I'm hoping that by sharing with you and talking this through with you, you'll see that there are parts about this that I would have approached completely differently, but I'm still showing up, I'm making the artwork, I'm practicing and trying, and I'm taking away really valuable lessons to come into my next painting with. All right, so at this point you're seeing me tap in my watercolors from my pans over there, and this is a really fun green by Daniel Smith that has a lot of variation to the color, and so I'm trying that to see if, as that dries, if that'll add some more interest into these trees. And you also see me kind of dab some of the color away with a paper towel just to see if I like that texture, and that does work pretty well. So always keep a little bit of either paper towel or a little cloth on hand that you can do that with if you're into water-based materials. So going off into another tangent that I'm just thinking of right now, I'm almost wishing another thing that I had done with this is I wish I hadn't taped off my edges. I really have been enjoying letting my certain elements of my painting become the frame. So imagine if I hadn't taped this off and instead I had let those two outside trees in the foreground become the frame of this painting. Can you imagine what I'm saying right now? So if those two trees were the edge of the painting, and it would be a very organic shape, it would not be straight, it would not be this clean cut line, and then if I had let like some roots kind of come down into more of the paper, and then maybe if I had sprinkled some mossy like texture around the edges outside of the painting, like imagine if I had let this be a little more playful. I think I would have ended up liking this overall page in my sketchbook even more if I hadn't put this boundary on myself of those tape lines. Sometimes a taped off little scene is exactly what our heart needs, and it's so satisfying to have those crisp edges, but I think I would have enjoyed the wildness a little bit more if I hadn't taped this off. So again, I'm getting kind of excited again to think about this and thinking, okay, so maybe when I come back in on that other experiment where I do my watercolor and pencils instead of the Neocolor, what if I also don't tape things off and I try this approach that I just mentioned of letting the trees be the frame? So see, this is why we sketchbook, people. We think about these things after we kind of flip back through our books and we get re-inspired and we want to come back and make more art. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be making more art for ourselves, for our mental health, for our growth. So thank you so much for attending my TED Talk on why you should be sketchbooking. I'm just joking. But in all seriousness, if you've made it this far into this rambling sketchbook session, could you give this video a like? And you know what? I want to see you in the comments. Could you leave me a comment? Tell me you made it this far. Tell me if you're making artwork with me right now, or if you're going to come back and do some later because of this. I want to hear from you. And I'm just like this little baby channel right now. I'm still growing and still figuring this out. You can tell me what kind of videos you like to see. If you're here and you want to subscribe and see more, tell me what you want to see because I can probably make it. So help a girl out. Give me a little bit of love down on the like button and in the comments, because ultimately I want to inspire more people to make more art. I am here to be a cozy, supportive art channel. And in fact, my branding words for the swimming owl are joy, hope, fun, humor, and magic. So like, if that's your vibe, you belong here. You are my people. And if you're cool to be kind, then you are absolutely welcome here, okay? We are here to support each other, make art together, and make this world a happier, more colorful place. Okay, so enough of all of that, back to the actual artwork here. At this point, I'm realizing, okay, I gotta step away from this, let it dry. And then I come back in, and here's where I'm bouncing back, trying to add in a little bit more lightness because I'm looking at my reference photo, looking at my trees, and I'm like, yeah, like they are dark, but at the same time, I let mine get too dark and I just don't like it. And so I'm trying to scribble back in some more soft light green texture, and it kind of works, but I think where I save these is when I come back in with some of my Copic white ink. It's a little pot of kind of like a white paint, and I tap in some highlights, and that helps add back in some magic to these trees and brings them to life quite a bit. So after I add in these little pops of this light green again, I realize this is where I need to make a change, and I realize it needs something separating those pine trees from the foreground, and I start to paint in this kind of lake or river. And I'm using my watercolor right now. I'm using a very light, almost like a periwinkle color that is what I would call a pastel watercolor, so it's not transparent. You can't really see through this unless it's like very, 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 very thinned out with water. And so I'm putting this in with that periwinkle color, and then I'll also put in a little bit of my Copic white to the top of it to really make it stand out even more. And this is again why I love a pastel watercolor. They are really cool. They show up really quite well on top of a dark base, and like it just really impresses me what they can do. And it's cool what they do on top of dry watercolors, but also even cooler when you tap them into a wet, dark background and how they kind of explode and make this almost like a star galaxy looking kind of blend. Anyway, it's something you need to play with if you haven't. Try some pastel watercolors, try them on top of a dark base, but then also try them inside of a wet watercolor, a wet dark watercolor that is. Okay, so at this point I'm just about done putting in the final watercolor and neocolor touches, and I'm finally going to get into the part that I feel makes this painting more me, more my style, and that comes in when I put in my little playful white highlights with my Copic white and my final colored pencil details. I've started to find that that is where I find the joy in my pieces if they're not turning out the way I was hoping to. It's kind of like getting through what you've probably heard people call like an ugly stage. For me, when I get to that final part of either putting in my stars or putting in my white highlights and really pulling in some more saturated color through colored pencil, that's when I get really happy with a piece. So here's my Copic white. It's this tiny little jar. If you've watched my other videos, you've heard me sing its praises before. It is an expensive little pot of white paint, but it has lasted me many years. Probably not going to last me quite as many now that I've been using it a lot more lately, but I use it a little bit oddly. I spray water or drop clean water into the pot actually to thin it down a bit, and then I paint it in where I see fit. Usually I'm using this for stars and on my moons, but here I decided to put it on like the tops of the mossy patches, almost like a highlight basically. And I really think that this helped these trees come to life, so to speak. And then I've also tapped it in on a couple of the pine trees, also into the water, and then I get a little bit more playful and I even put dots of it into the sky background, which then ends up looking like snow, which was not my intention originally, but you know what, it ended up looking really cool, so I don't regret it. Now, if this little pot of Copic white is not in your budget, but you want to try out a similar effect, I'm sure you could get a similar effect with just some white acrylic paint, maybe even white gouache. You just want something that's not going to be transparent. So you want it to have some thickness to it and to be able to show up, especially if you're using like a watercolor and it's already kind of light. But I've just found that this Copic white is amazing and I'm really happy with it, and I would absolutely purchase it again. I will be purchasing it again when I run out. I do have a Posca white pen and it works well for making like a very controlled line, but it does not dry as bright white as this Copic does. So yes, it works, but not as well. So that's my thought on a Posca pen. It does tend to let some of the color show through from whatever was underneath. You can also try white gel pens, but I tend to struggle with those. I struggle to actually get the ink to come out of them, and I find them frustrating. So I will just keep coming back to this little pot of white over and over and over again. All right, so here I've decided to intensify that limey chartreusey green with some Prismacolor pencil here. And that actually does work really well and brings some life into the tree as well. Because again, you know, I didn't like how muddy they started to look. That was one of my biggest disappointments about this piece. So this helped a lot. And the Prismacolor colored pencils do really well on this Neocolor watercolor background that I've got going on. But the watercolor pencils are not as vibrant or as soft as the Prismacolor. So the Prismacolor worked better than the watercolor pencils. So I'm just going to keep adding in some final details here. And in a couple of minutes, I realized that I didn't add anywhere near enough of the kind of chaotic branches up at the top. And I'm definitely not going to add in as many that is in the reference photo, because that would make this piece look, like I just said, chaos. But I do need to add in a few more, and a colored pencil actually works really nicely for that instead of the watercolors or the neocolors, because I'm able to make really fine tiny lines, and so you're still getting that hint of those branches there without them being so in your face. But yeah, those are kind of the final touches that I put into this piece here. I hope you are making some artwork with me. I hope you're having fun right now. And if you're not ready for your art time to end and you would like to color next, I have some freebie coloring pages. I actually have one that I just released the other day. I'll put the link down below. You can quickly download that from my Dropbox. It's some really pretty little pumpkins that you can color in and keep having fun. It's fun to do with a friend or a loved one. I like to do that with my daughter once in a while. And if you'd like even more free coloring pages, you can actually go sign up for my artist newsletter. It's really casual. I only email you when I've got like several things to tell you at once, and usually there's freebies involved or coupons to my Etsy shop or announcements about YouTube videos or Skillshare classes and just fun, happy, art-related things. There's like nothing crazy going on in that. So if you want 20 free more coloring pages, you can get that from my newsletter by going to my website and signing up for that. I have loved having you here. I've loved sketchbooking with you today. In just a moment, I'm going to give you the full view of how this turned out. You'll get some really nice juicy close-ups. And I would love to see if you made something too. So find me and show me what you made. Let's keep making artwork together. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to let you just finish this off with a little bit of music. And I can't wait to see you next time.